Well, I'm back from a pretty decently long absence. Spent the last couple of weeks working on the release of the album, of course, which has been out for a week now. But I am ready to pick back where I left off on composition and production. Today, mainly production. I'm going to start with a simple question. What's the goal of production? In the days of analog recording, they basically had to produce a song before they recorded it. Bands were volume leveled by distance, where they'd place musicians in specific configurations, all pointed towards a horn that would shape a master track, which they later used to cut vinyl. So louder instruments were placed behind the softer ones, and they couldn't use drum kits because it would just overpower the rest of the band. So you hear a lot of old jazz recordings where there's a drummer playing wood blocks, and that's really all the percussion that they could have had. Effects like reverb, it was created acoustically by using plates to reflect sound. Microphones made that part a lot easier, and magnetic tape was the next major step that really led us into modern recording, like multi-tracking and just really the digital recording age. A lot of that's summed up in this book, which I'm reading. I think it's a pretty good read. It's called The History of Music Production by Richard James Burgess. So in our current digital age, anyone with a cheap microphone, like this one, which cost me, I think, $45, no more than $50. This is a Audio-Technica ATR 2500. It's a USB microphone, so I don't even use an interface. I just plug it straight into my computer. But anyone with a cheap microphone can record music in their car and apartment like me and make it sound bearable. What we do now is technically post-production. It's After Effects that we're applying to the raw tracks. But in the context of how things really operate, this is really the bulk of where the work goes in to making music sound good. There's some pre-recording stuff like selecting mics as well, but a lot of that's been made easier by the digital age. The tool that lets us do all this is the Digital Audio Workstation, which we call the DAW for short. I use Reaper, but there are plenty of great ones available. Pro Tools, Ableton. The DAW lets you record your tracks, mix and master as you need. So I'm just going to talk about some basic production techniques and really what they're used for. The goal of production is to control the sound of raw music after they're recorded. And in traditional terms, that meant trying to recreate an authentic performance. Theaters were built with acoustics in mind to create the right volume and to capture effects like reverb, which is what I'm going to start with. Nowadays, music is recorded in rooms or soundproof audio booths, places that aren't designed to give us acoustic effects. So when you record a vocal track, it becomes really dry. None of the vibrations that you get in reality are captured. Microphones also introduce some level of gating, which is a volume cutoff floor that's used to suppress background noise, and that removes reverb as well. It's one of the reasons why your voice always sounds funny to you when you hear it in a recording. It's partially because you don't hear the reverb that you're used to coming back, and also because the reverb that's created in your head alters the way that you perceive your own voice. DAWs allow us to artificially put reverb back in. It takes your track and it bounces it back to you. You can alter this with certain user inputs like delay time, room size, all of which combine to simulate reverb or an echo producing environment. So in a lot of bad black metal, you always hear the room size turned all the way up with huge delay time. So it sounds like they're recording in a cave and it's super saturated. On a technical level, reverb is stretching out your frequencies by creating these double echoes, and this actually causes some problems like phase interference, especially when your delay time is too long. I think beyond 30 milliseconds is usually where weird things start to happen. But at a fundamental level, reverb's not that strange of a concept, and it's not too hard to use. On the other hand, there are a lot of way more complicated tools we can use to control dynamic frequencies. As I mentioned before, a lot of what production's trying to do is to balance frequencies. At any given moment, each track has its unique profile due to things like harmonic overtones. But more important, the profile changes over the course of the track. When we put these tracks together, we're in effect stacking the frequencies on top of each other by superposition of waves. In order to produce an audible mix, you have to find a way to move these frequencies around so that everything can occupy its own space equally. I like to think of production like filling up a storage locker. You have frequency space, which is like stacking boxes in one line up high, But if you stack a lot of tracks with similar frequencies, they'll add up and outgain the rest of the tracks. If the dynamics are so out-leveled like this, either that frequency will clip the upper threshold, or everything else is just going to be under-leveled and get buried. I talked about bass in the last video, and it's an example of this. Bass sits in a frequency range that's similar to the kick drum lower toms, as well as the lower region of the guitar. If you scoop the mids on your guitar, that means you're creating a bass boost that makes it even worse. So if you're going to prioritize the level of the guitar riff as well as the kick drum because you want to hear double kicks, when everything gets stacked together, you're going to lose the bass because otherwise everything else would get clipped. Fortunately, we have a whole storage locker we can fill out. One thing you can do to help is to separate these tracks stereoscopically, like I've mentioned before. In layman's terms, you just pan them out. This is in contrast to a mono track where everything is just in the middle and fighting each other. With surround sound or headphones, this keeps the pieces from interfering with each other too much by moving them around. The alternate approach is to use EQ, equalization. This is where you can selectively apply gain to certain frequencies or a range of frequencies. Just like you might scoop your mids, you can separate similar frequencies by boosting them at different levels to even everything out. So you can EQ the kick drum to boost one range of frequencies, the bass to another, and put the guitars out of the way. Some death metal bands, especially tech death, get this weird idea where they EQ the shit out of the bass drum straight into the high frequencies, so it sounds like this. It definitely solves the problem, but at the cost of making your bass drum sound not like a bass drum. Then the only way to get the same sound live is to trigger it, because real bass drums don't sound like that. No matter how many blankets you stuff into it, it's not going to get that high of a sound. There's a better video by Fenris, who's probably a more knowledgeable person on the subject. But you use EQ, you get all your frequencies leveled out, you pan everything around, everything has its own space. It doesn't necessarily mean that your entire track is fully leveled, otherwise production would be pretty simple. We want to fill up the rest of our storage locker, but unfortunately tracks don't come packaged in nice boxes. Each track has its own unique dynamic profile, and it's not easy to put them all together. The standard method for dealing with this is to use compression. Compression is a powerful tool where you get to set a threshold in which higher dynamics are clipped off, and the amount of clipping can be adjusted by things like ratios, knee sizes, high-low pass filters. There are other parameters like attack and release. I hardly understand what any of these do, but the result of this is that you can control the dynamics across the entire track to a certain degree. Compression is a necessary tool in volume leveling in order to avoid clipping your true threshold, but I think it's severely overused and abused to the point where music can suffer because of this. This is a thing called the loudness war, and there's a lot of resources out there that explain it very well. Basically, in order to make a track sound loud, you have to ultra compress your master track in order to bring everything uniformly as close to the volume threshold as possible. This makes everything sound very loud, but it also takes all your dynamic profiles and makes them homogeneous. Say this line is a threshold. Since I play black metal, my guitar's tracks are naturally pretty flat because of distortion, which is a product of clipping and gain, and the use of tremolo picking produces very little dynamics. But say you have this flat track and you throw a snare drum, you're going to get a spike. If you raise the overall volume to the highest point without clipping the snare, then the guitar is going to sit at a pretty low level. So the solution figured out by bad producers is to compress the shit out of the entire master track and then uniformly apply the volume level back to a higher point. Now the guitar track is really loud and the snare hit looks like a little bump. This really does solve the problem in a certain way, but imagine what effect this has on the actual sound of the music. Normally, the snare hit would add volume and make your master track louder. Because of the compression, something different happens. At that moment in time, all the tracks that are compressed together have their volume cut so that the combination of the guitar and the snare sounds just as loud as the guitar on its own. That means the whole song sounds like it's just getting sucked out whenever you get a snare hit or a kick drum, or really when you add any sort of sound, like new tracks, vocals, synth, a guitar solo, whatever. Everything else gets pulled down to compensate for the extra volume. Genius producers, I think they've somehow convinced the pop industry and its consumers that this is what music should sound like. If you listen to a pop song on the radio, first off, the kick and the snare drum are both fake samples. But in pop music, especially dance music, the tracks are usually so compressed that it sounds like the song is getting sucked out on every beat because of the fake percussion that happens. The reason producers do this, I think, is just because it's easy. All the problems with frequency and dynamics are circumvented by compression. Music naturally has dynamic profiles, but now it's being crushed into these flat bricks, and they produce songs by stacking these bricks on top of each other, hence the term brick walling. This is the reason why Metallica's Death Magnetic sounds really shitty. It's the equivalent of filling up our storage locker by feeding all our stuff into a garbage compactor, crushing it all down, and then saying you did a good job. The storage locker is full, but the integrity of the music's been destroyed. Volume leveling is a really difficult task. You give a little, you take a little. If you want to hear everything, your riff, your double kicks, your bass line, vocals, lead, harmony, layer of synth, like I mentioned before, it's all going to take a lot of effort just to get everything to sound right. I found out doing this the hard way by mixing Nightmare. If you take shortcuts, your music's going to suffer. It's a combination of production techniques, both pre-recording and post, in order to get all your frequencies balanced correctly. And like I mentioned in the last video, composition does go a long way.